Welcome to Greentime. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode is called Nicotine Bees, and we're going to look at an explanation of why there was a great bee die-off in the years 2004 and 2005.
At first, many possible causes were considered by scientists and beekeepers. Honeybee disease like nosema, foul brood, and chalk brood. Parasites like varroa mites. Stress from moving commercial beehives for pollinating crops. Viruses like Israeli acute paralysis virus, genetically modified or GMO crops, cell phone electromagnetic fields, and pesticides used on crops, yards, or in beehives themselves.
I said to myself, what do all these have in common across the country? And at first I ruled out disease because a disease simply does not spread that fast. Disease takes a long time to move around through the country.
I brought back here, right here to this warehouse, that was in mid-November. I brought back 30-some dead beehives, or 30-some hives, some of them alive and some of them dead. Penn State showed up here on Sunday afternoon with a whole crew, pulled samples out of this stuff, and within 4 or 5 days, basically said, wow, we ain't never seen nothing like this.
Of course, early on, they were finding promising things, like it was the Israeli virus, and then it was something else. And a new news bulletin would come out and, claim that they'd found the cause of the bee collapse. And then a week later, they would discover that it was still going on in spite of, For example, the Israeli virus got a lot of press for a while, and then somebody discovered they had some bees frozen in a freezer for 7 years, and they had it. So that meant that the virus was already there and hadn't caused problems.
Now, adult bees are pretty hardy. The only thing that really kills adult bees, well, there are some viruses, but mostly it's nosema, which is a gut parasite. It's called a microsporidian. But when they sampled my bees at the university, they didn't find high nosema levels, and we didn't have this new nosema back then, and nosema was always endemic, and I even fed Fumidil by times, which is something you can do against nosema.
Bees, from an evolutionary point of view, have a relatively simple immune system. They're not very able to take care of themselves is kind of the simple way to put it. And so they're vulnerable to bacteria and viruses, and over the years there have been large die-offs of bees.
What we have found is these bees ain't got no immune system. Something's wiped out their immune system. That's like AIDS, I mean, AIDS, is not killing anybody. AIDS is just, that's a virus. That's an immune system breakdown, and then you get all kinds of other funguses and, like in people, pneumonia and all that kind of stuff that come in and wipe them out.
Many beekeepers now are just suspicious about the whole thing. All we know is there's a big die-off taking place.
Well, there is some theory about pesticides, and I have been hit some pesticides over the years, but I don't know whether there's a specific element in the pesticides that's causing a problem. It very well could be.
A personal friend of mine, Murray Forgrave in New Brunswick, that called me in the fall of 2001 or 2002 telling me we got a problem. We got this new pesticide that's basically wiping out my bees. The bees were on clover, had been potatoes the year before, and the bees are getting something out of this clover, and by fall the bees are dead, or vanishing,
But not all the possible causes worked. Honeybee diseases like nosema, foul brood, and chalk brood have been with the bees for many years, and there are collapsed hives without these diseases. Pests and parasites like varroa mites are well-known problems that many beekeepers already know how to control. Stresses from moving commercial beehives for pollinating crops have existed for decades, and many dead bee colonies were never moved. Viruses like Israeli acute paralysis virus have not spread around the world. and bees with the disease do not exhibit symptoms characteristic of the collapsing colonies. Genetically modified plants are toxic specifically to other insects and are not allowed in some countries that are having colonies collapse. Cell phone electromagnetic fields have been around for long before the initial bee die-offs. By 2005, a new class of pesticide had come to dominate the global market.
Welcome back to Greentime. I'm host Don Fitz. We just saw the information about the bees dying off. I have a couple of guests with me who are very knowledgeable of biological issues. I have Claudia Henriquez, who is studying biology, is with the Gateway Green Alliance, and I have Sarah Heyman, who is a cell biologist at Washington University. Welcome both of you to the show. Now, Sarah, could you tell me what was the DVD saying about what are some of the reasons that bees could die off all of a sudden?
Well,
if you don't know, if you don't have a theory, but you're just starting off from the beginning, what could you say might be happening?
well, there are a number of things that might be causing this. There's something called a varroa mite. A mite is a very small parasite, and if you can imagine something small enough that gets underneath the skin, in essence, of a bee, and it lives on the back of the bee. So if a bee is that, it must be. But if you have enough of these, it weakens the colony. And then if you have a bad winter or you have a weak colony and anything else happens, they die.
So in any sort of parasite, like there might be other ones that affect the gut or different parts of the bee. And
right.
Okay.
So there's that. There are these parasites. There are other diseases, bacteria and viruses, like we would get a flu or, let's say, smallpox virus or something like that, chicken pox, what have you. That might cause a die-off and a collapse of a colony.
Bees can get bad colds.
Yes, big time, big time.
Okay.
Yes, you don't want the kind of colds that they would be getting.
Okay.
Then there are, of course, the other pesticides that happen. There is stress.
If there's a new pesticide, then that could be causing the problem.
Or even an improperly timed pesticide that has been used before, but you just apply it at the wrong time, you may very well be catching the bees and killing them off that way. You may have...
So it's important to remember that in the word pesticide, side means kill.
Kills, right.
Okay.
And pest is generally means insect. Okay. So insect killing thing.
Yes, okay.
Okay. So in addition to these diseases, you also have stress. We have the fact that we now ship our bees. It used to be that just about everybody had a local beekeeper or kept bees themselves. And it was very, very easy to get bees to a local orchard. Now, because we have many, many fewer beekeepers, we have these big truckloads of bees that are moved from Missouri to Florida.
Cross country.
Yeah. From okay, we want them to go after they go in the winter from Florida doing the citrus. Maybe they'll go north to do the blueberries and cherries in Wisconsin, and maybe they'll go out west to do the almonds in California. Exactly. So that kind of traveling can be very, very stressful on a human, let alone a little bee that's going around being jostled around in this compartment.
So there's a lot of explanations. Claudia, let me ask you, the DVD puts forth the position that it's nicotine-based pesticides that were affecting bees. Now, how would a new pesticide suddenly disrupt bees' lives so much?
Well, nicotine is actually a natural pesticide, insecticide. And
the same sort of nicotine that's in cigarettes, right?
Yes, exactly. And we have what are called nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Insects and humans have them, although insects have them in a much higher number. These receptors have them in a much higher number. So these insecticides are also toxic to humans, but since we have such fewer receptors, it's not as toxic to us.
And we're much bigger.
And we're much bigger, exactly. And so what these receptors do is once they receive the nicotine, those receptors open ion channels, which are basically gateways in and out of the cell. And these gateways are basically dictating the chemical signals that the brain and the central nervous system sends to the rest of the body. That's why it's called a systemic insecticide.
So if you mess up that, you're messing up the whole function, the brain functioning of the bee.
The whole brain functioning, muscular or body functioning, everything else is disrupted, and that's why these bees start behaving in such strange ways. They lose their ability to communicate. They become disoriented. They can't make their way back to the hive, which is why these hives are empty. These bees go out, are exposed to this pesticide, and lose their ability to come back to the hive. It's like this overwhelming, excitation, and then they just go into paralysis and die.
Okay, let's take a look at some more of the DVD and have an announcement, and then we're going to come back for a further discussion of the whole basis of nicotine pesticides in the Great Bee Die-Off of 2004 and 2005.
The plant, when it grows, will take up the substance and it will reappear in the pollen and the nectar of the plant. And so later, when the plant is blooming, we have problems with the bees.
The manufacturers say that it doesn't go up into the pollen and nectar. Other scientists out here that have done their own studies are finding high levels of it in pollen and nectar. You get a cold front coming through for rain for a week, and they got to dig into that old pollen they got stored away. All they have is that contaminated pollen. These bees are new beehives that were started this spring, and they're doing well. But the minute they start getting into the water and the pollen coming off of corn, and so these bees are going to get moved out of here and hopefully get moved into an area in upstate New York where we don't have near as much of this. But we still, it's everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere.
By 2004, there was a substantial share of the conventional corn crop, probably over 90%, where the seed treatment was now a nicotinal, either Imidacloprid or Clothianidin or Thiamethoxam. Thiamethoxam was sold as Cruiser, Imidacloprid as Gaucho, and Clothianidin as Poncho. And not only had the chemical industry decided that, well, this is a good idea to switch chemistries, they also had a strong reason to substantially increase the punch delivered by these seed treatments. And this is an important part of the story, and one that's not known or understood by very many people. At this time, the biotech companies were coming out with their first genetically engineered seeds to control the corn rootworm. The young corn plant, when it first germinated, wasn't producing enough of the Bt toxin in the roots to stop the feeding by the corn rootworm. So when they realized they had an early season efficacy problem, they solved it by going first to the encapsulation and the timed release of the seed treatment, and then they went to a higher dose. They increased the dose of nicotinol, which started out at 0.25 milligrams per seed. They jumped it up fivefold to 1.25 milligrams per seed. And those seeds hit the market in about 2004. By 2005, a significant portion of the corn was planted to those seeds. And I think it peaked around 2006. What it did was it resulted in a higher level of imidacloprid up through the corn plant for longer in the season, to the point where the level in the pollen collected by the bees that might be foraging in a cornfield reached toxic levels. We don't have technology capable of measuring it, but it's still high enough to cause an impact on the neurological system in the bee, so that it has the strength to go out and fly, and it can fly. But imagine how fine-tuned that neurological system of the bee is to be able to find find its way back to the hive. I mean, they don't have a roadmap. They don't really see very well. It's a very fine-tuned way that they relate to their environment, and I think it's that feature of bee neurological behavior and performance and health that is impaired by the nicotinols. It's not killing them, it's impairing their ability to find their way back to the hive, and that's what causes colony collapse disorder.
And that's what's happened to honeybees. And they lose their memory and they can't find their way home. And I can give you guys, beekeepers, that have ran while the rest of us are all having problems. They're doing fine until they encounter these insecticides one time. This past winter, citrus. They started using Bravado, which is a nicotinoid, systemic, this past year for greening. These guys that had never had a problem before, where they ran from the woods to the woods and only went to oranges and basically stayed away from all kinds of row crops and cotton and all those things where we're using this stuff, weren't having a problem. But the minute they started using this stuff on citrus, they got the same thing going on we seen in 2000. I have conversations this week with beekeepers in Georgia. 40% of their box empty.
Welcome back to Greentime. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're talking about nicotine bees, and you've seen a couple of segments from the DVD Nicotine Bees, and I have a couple of biologists to talk with us today. I have Sarah Heyman, who is at Washington University, an entomologist, and also have Claudia Henriquez, who's studying biology, and she's with the Gateway Green Alliance. So what do y'all think about the explanation that it's nicotine-based pesticides that caused the bee decline?
Well, I think that it's probably at least a big portion, but I'm not going to wholeheartedly say it's the only thing that's causing it.
What else could be contributing?
Well, it could be a couple of factors. For example, the nicotine used as a pesticide has been used as a pesticide for a very long time.
Oh, it wasn't just introduced in 2004?
No. The level of spraying has gone up, partly because of the changing of pesticide regulations. The way we apply it has changed.
But is it that pretty much the same thing as introducing it? Because if you have a sublethal dose before 2004 and then you increase it rapidly in 2004, it might confuse a few bees before 2004, but you increase it a lot after that.
Well, there is that. But one of the other things is that people were now, because there was a new formulation, they were now mixing together what are fungicides, which are things that keep mold and things like that from growing on the crops, and herbicides, which are literally weed killers, and as well as these insect killers, these pesticides.
Oh, they would mix them all together
and spray? They would mix them all together.
And that wasn't done before?
No, they tended not to do that before. And what they also tended to do was spray it during bloom time. And
so the time that you spray is critical.
Exactly, because if they had sprayed it after, when the fruit was, say, developed, you wouldn't have bees coming in because nothing's in bloom at that point. And they would have been, the bees that the people were moving from site to site would have been removed and not exposed to these before.
But they are saying, I mean, that the residue stay in these plants for a long time.
Right.
So that even if you do sort of time it, you try to time it to not affect the bees, I mean, these compounds are staying around a lot longer
than they anticipated.
But they linger more now after they spray?
Well, it's complicated because nothing in nature is ever simple. And one of the facts, for example, there's been some recent work by some folks at the USDA, which shows that a lot of these nicanoids actually are extra stress to the bee. And so when they have this bacterial infection that comes in, it wipes out the colony, whereas the colony before, when it saw that bacterial infection, would be able to fight it off and survive.
They are finding that the bees, I think, that are left, that they actually can, do tests on, they find that they are co-infected by bacteria and virus or mites. It's like they become so immunocompromised by these pesticides that they're catching everything, basically.
Okay, but I thought the DVD ruled that out, and I thought their argument was that with this bee die-off, you didn't find massive piles of bees anywhere. And if you had bees that had a parasite infection or some sort of disease, then they would drop dead nearby. And I thought the argument was that the nicotine-based pesticides confused the ability of the bees to communicate, to think, and so they would get lost and die. And so I thought that was a pretty convincing argument that the nicotine pesticides were the critical factor.
Well, I think they're important, and I wouldn't say not, but I think that it's too simple to say it's just one thing. Also, we do know that we have changed the way pesticides and even the allowability of pesticides and these particular pesticides of being sprayed. But if you have these residuals around in these sort of sub-lethal doses, and then you get in these infections which are always around. So in other words, it's like a human. Right. If you're stressed, if you're not if you've been ill already, and then you get another illness on top of it, you're more apt
One
to
thing
have
which you said I think was
problems.
very important a few minutes ago was that they're now mixing pesticides.
Yes.
And a lot of times we think, and the federal government often implies, that there's one drug, one chemical that has one effect. But sometimes you have chemical A and chemical B, and you don't get the effect with either one, but you put the two together, and then you might get the effect.
Right, and one of the things is that a lot of this happened when oil costs went up. So if you were a farmer and you had to apply this stuff on your field, then odds were you were going to mix these things together and apply them on the field at one time. Because it was just more expensive to go and do these several times through.
I found the nicotine argument to be very convincing because exactly there was not the evidence of these piles of dead bees that you would see, and all these other things that they, the cell phone radiation or, the pesticides and bacterial infection. These have all been around since way before the die-offs. And they were able to cope with them. And now all of a sudden, 1 year, something new happens in agriculture and they can no longer cope and they're disappearing.
And I think that's true. I think that one of the other things was it was very misleading for Bayer to put on these, on the side of the canisters, that this is okay for you to spray during bloom time. I mean, they were saying that
was critical.
And that was the critical period when the bees would be exposed. So if they had done this, say, after bloom.
Sarah Heyman, Claudia Henriquez, I want to thank you very much for showing up to this episode, but I'm getting the wrap-up time. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this episode of Greentime, and be sure to look at us next episode.